Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's February 1st, 2024. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. Last week in my introduction, I mentioned some topics that we didn't actually get around to discussing. So this week, I'm skipping the preamble and we're diving right in. The only thing I'll say up front is that we're going to start by exploring the term Judeo-Christian. So let's get into it. But
before we get into that topic, I have a quick correction to make from last week. I slandered the late Cassius Dio by insinuating that he was an unreliable historical source when I was thinking of the Historia Augusta. My apologies.
I'm sure I'll forgive you. So, Judeo-Christian. That's a somewhat contentious term. I'm interested in exploring why it's contentious. First of all, what does the term mean? What are the implications of it? When did it start being used? And why do a lot of people, especially on the alt-right or dissident right, have an issue with that term? So for me, on the surface at least, I don't see a major issue with the term for a variety of reasons. Most basically, Jesus was a Jew. He lived as a Jew. He practiced kosher. He followed the Torah. He followed the Abrahamic law. He did not break the Sabbath, despite what the Pharisees claimed he did. He followed perfectly the law, the covenant, the Old Testament, everything that's in the Old Testament. So, despite all that, there's people who don't like that term. Ness, where do you think that the resistance to that term comes from?
Well, do you think that Judeo-Islam or Christianic Islam or some other combination of either of those religious faiths in connection with Islam also makes sense?
I do not. If you're from a Christian perspective, the connection from Christianity to Judaism makes it's inextricable. Obviously, Christianity came after Judaism, and it explicitly is built upon the Old Testament. For instance, Augustine, quote from Augustine, quote, "The New Testament is hidden in the Old. The Old is made accessible by the New." There is a very clear link that I do not believe exists at all in the same way that Christianity has to Islam. Now, I know that Islam acknowledges Jesus, I believe. I don't know very much about Islam, so I can't speak much on that. But I do know that they certainly hold Jesus and revere him and many of the Old Testament prophets. So I see what you're saying by there being a connection. But I guess just Judaism and Christianity are much closer, to me, have a closer connection than Islam and the other two.
I think that's only because they're closer in time, but there is no Islam without Judaism. So I think that's a rather arbitrary distinction. And we look at the term Judeo-Christian and we see from Google Ngram Books Viewer that shows the percentages of terms that have been used historically have been used in a whole library of published English work shows that the term was effectively invented in the mid-20th century in the wake of World War II. So you have 2 millennia almost of Christian history where, to put it to understate it, it would be an understatement to say that over those 2,000 years, leading Christian thinkers would have recoiled at the idea that Judaism and Christianity were like blood brothers, or the terms that there was so much shared between them, especially theologically. You look back at going from John Chrysostom to Martin Luther and everywhere in between, before and after, and there are things that are said about Jews that couldn't be published anywhere. Even anonymously on the internet, it would be hard to publish them under a pseudonym that was not hiding behind the idea that they were looking at it from a historical perspective, but were instead making the arguments that a lot of these leading Christian thinkers have made throughout the course of Christian history.
I know Martin Luther. I've read parts of his on the Jews and their lies. That's the treatise you're referring to, and I think his frustration came from early in his career. He was seemingly not hostile to Jews, and I think the frustration for him came from he thought that the Jews just didn't know about the Word of God, and that once the gospel and basically that it wasn't Jews per se that were the problem. He didn't have a problem with Jews per se. He had a problem with them not getting on board with the break from Judaism that Jesus represented.
I don't think the argument is that Christian thinkers throughout the ages have had an issue with ethnic Judaism. It is the fact that Jews, from the Christian perspective, very clearly were the murderers of Christ. And repentance is a universal monotheistic religion, and I think more than anything else that monotheism is the legacy, or monotheism in Christianity is the legacy of Judaism more than any other aspect of Christianity relative to other religious traditions.
So you said that the term Judeo-Christian would have been anathema to earlier Christian thinkers, such as Martin Luther, John Calvin, I assume, people like that. But today, not only does the term is not offensive to at least Christian leaders, bishops, priests, they embrace the term Judeo-Christian. And for instance, Robert Barron, I just watched a video on him. He goes out of his way to embrace the term and talk about how much work the church needs to do to combat anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, even the idea of it, is antithetical to being a Christian. You can't be a Christian and be quote anti-Semitic. So presumably he's saying, obviously completely repudiating people like Martin Luther. So what do you think is the reason why there'd be such a complete rejection of the term to now an embrace of the term?
I think that's a mischaracterization to say it's an embrace. I think if you polled Americans, most people would say that that's not a term that they think describes Christianity today. It was a lot more contentious when the term was used, or when the term was at its height in the aughts, in the 2000s, during the Iraq War. It was a pretty strong, repetitious point of criticism from anti-war voices to look at the term Judeo-Christian as a neocon term that was used as a tool to get the Western world in general and the United States in particular to effectively do the foreign policy bidding of Israel.
So do you think it was a cynical way for neocons to exploit Gentiles in order for them to get on board with an agenda that, at least on the surface, doesn't really make sense? Why would it benefit white evangelical Christians? And you're saying they used Judeo-Christian to get Middle America on board with the agenda?
Yes, by tying Judaism and its contemporary existence in the Levant, to tie that to American foreign policy, it was necessary to get a farmer in Iowa to believe that what was good for Israel was good for America.
And I would argue, whether it was cynical or not, the reason it was successful is because there's more than just a kernel of truth to it. There's a bushel of truth to it. Going back, I'll just go back briefly to some Christian doctrine or theological disputes or discussion. I have Matthew 5, verses 17 through 20. This is Jesus, the preamble to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." Now, I understand that there's lots of debate over what that passage means, what the word fulfill means, whether the word fulfill is even the right translation. But I quote that just to say that it's not like they're pulling a rabbit out of the hat by linking Christianity to Judaism and drawing what I believe is an inextricable link between the two. So I do think the doctrine matters in the sense that the reason why that was so effective on, as you said, a farmer in Iowa, why would a farmer in Iowa get on conflate his interest with the interest of Israel? In my view, that wouldn't have worked unless there was, like I said, a very strong basis for linking those two.
Well, that dispensationalist argument, again, that's something that's very novel in the history of Christianity. That's something that would be unrecognizable to Christian thinkers for at least 1,800 years. So, of course, it's indisputable that Christianity came out of the Levant, but again, the argument with Islam holds. You don't have any modern Islam without Judaism either. So, can we take that same line of argument and settle the issues between the Israelis and Hamas, or the Jordanians, or the Saudis, or Egyptians, or any other Islamic Judeo conflicts? During their Crusades, tens of thousands of Jews were massacred by crusading armies that were headed to the Levant to throw Muslims out of, with the goal of initially reconquering Jerusalem, and then for 2 centuries trying to protect a Christian state in the Middle East from Muslims.
Okay, then I guess we're getting back to then if it was basically an insane idea back then that you would link these two, then why is it done today and done so successfully today? Or do you think it is successful?
I think its success probably peaked after 2001, during the Bush administration, when the neocon warmongering was at its height. I think it has trended downward since then. You can actually see that in the Google engrams references to the term Judeo-Christian. You certainly don't hear it as frequently as you did 10 or 15 years ago. But I would posit that the primary reason is because Christianity is dying, is effectively dead in the West, or it's moribund. It really is dead already in Western Europe, and it's in the process of dying in North America. And so it is easily captured and piloted by foreign policy interests outside of the United States.
But I think, couldn't you apply almost the reverse logic to that? If Christianity is weak, then appealing to Christianity because the appealing to Judeo-Christian relies upon Christians caring about Christianity. If they don't, why would that religious argument even work on them if Christianity is moribund and ineffective? Well,
as the saying goes, that people are as right-wing as they're allowed to be. I think contemporary Christians are as Christian as they're allowed to be, and that provides a high-status elite sponsorship for justification for being Christian. If you are a Christian for the sake of, if you're a Christian Zionist, then you will have friends in the American power structure in a way that you won't if you're any other type of Christianity. It's why evangelical Christians have more purchase than, say, Orthodox Christians in the United States.
What do you mean by having more purchase?
Having more political representation, having more institutional power. I want to circle back real quick and get your thinking on when you said that you think that Jesus didn't come to in any way challenge any of the current existing laws, but just to fulfill them, which almost definitionally, if the criticism is that they're not currently being adhered to correctly, or they're not being fulfilled, then fulfilling them in opposition to the current ruling structure, I think, is definitionally challenging those laws.
I think he's challenging the artificial crap that the Pharisees had laid on top of the perfect laws of God, the Torah. He was not rejecting the Sabbath or any of the rules that God had set up. He was rejecting the artificial stuff that the Pharisees put on top of it.
So, well, like, what about the dietary laws that are present in, say, Deuteronomy that precede the Pharisees? For example, or in particular, the Mark 5:17. Is that what it is?
It is Mark
7:19.
7:19. So yeah, the one you're referring to, I'll read the King James version. It says, "Because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the drought, purging all meats." As with almost everything in the King James version, it's pretty hard to understand. So I'm going to go to the NIV version now, which is, "For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body." So then the NIV adds something in parentheses that says, "In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean." Now, from what I understand, this was added at some point after the King James Version in around 1610, 1615, somewhere in there, because it wasn't in there, this line at the end, "In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean." This is in the NIV, which was finished in the 1970s. So at some point, unless it was in some version before the King James Version, at some point between 1600s and 1970s, that line was added. And to me, that goes to the point of, why would they feel, who are the translators, why would they feel it necessary to add that line unless they were trying to further the supersessionism viewpoint that the Old Testament, or much of the Old Testament, doesn't have to be followed anymore?
Well, I think the parenthetical part is explanatory. The New International Version dumbs things down quite a bit, almost to the extent that it's too much, where you have a parable given to you and then it's explained in excruciating detail what it means, when they're not particularly complicated parables to understand. But if we go back to find a version that predates the King James Bible, and we look back at the Latin Vulgate, and we see the same effective message that we get in the King James Bible and the New International Version. So Jesus saith to them, "So are you also without knowledge? Understand you not that everything from without entering into a man cannot defile him, because it entereth not into his heart, but goeth into his belly, and goeth out into the privy, purging all meats." And so that parenthetical explanation, I don't know what other reading you can have of those two verses that contradict what is in the parentheses to give an explanation of what that means. It's sort of hard to follow because of the way that it's written. But clearly what Jesus seems to be saying is that it doesn't matter what you eat or drink. What matters is what you believe, what you think, what your intentions are. And so that seems to me to be undercutting not just the Pharisees' emphasis on strict adherence to the dietary laws, but these dietary prescriptions that were given in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, predating the Pharisees that were operating in the time contemporary to Jesus. And additionally, Jesus heals lepers by laying his hands on them on the Sabbath, no less, in strict violation of the Jewish law at the time, which both forbid working on the Sabbath and also forbid touching lepers at all, because it was said to make those who came into contact with lepers not just physically unclean, but also spiritually unclean.
Yeah, and I don't know anywhere close to enough about the Old Testament and the rules to say which were, quote, legitimate and what was just added by the Pharisees for their own self-interest. But I take your point. I certainly take your point.
Well, I think we're on to a digression here, but I take your point too, that clearly Christianity grew out of a Jewish state at the time. But I think it's difficult to just hand wave away the intervening 1900 years and then think that in modern society we've picked back up where we should have been, except that Christian leadership, going all the way back from Paul through John Paul II had it wrong, and now we're getting it right at this point.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of examples like that. This recent document that was issued by the Vatican saying that it's now acceptable to bless same-sex couples and same-sex marriages.
Well, I think that is, to be precise, there hasn't been any change in the teaching that allows same-sex marriages to be blessed. What the papal bull was clarifying was that, or was reiterating, it was reiterating the fact that priests are allowed to bless same-sex couples, but not in the sacrament of marriage. Not anywhere that I've read. Now, it will be, at some point, someone will interpret it that way, and that clearly is the intention, but that's not what it was explicitly said.
But, and again, getting back to the letter versus the spirit, obviously, the spirit of that is removing some of the stigma from same-sex couples. So I thank you for that clarification. They are not saying that you can bless gay marriages. So if they're not doing that, what do you think the intent was for issuing this declaration?
Well, Francis is the Antichrist, and certainly his intention is to get priests to interpret it either honestly or furtively as allowing them to bless the sacrament of marriage among same-sex couples.
And it is interesting to see the many of the clergy in Africa are rejecting this and saying, basically they're saying we are disregarding this. We're certainly not going to be blessing any same-sex couples. So it's just that split is just, I think, going to continue to widen between the African church, which, if it doesn't already have more absolute numbers, probably will soon.
That's certainly where the energy is than the numbers are.
So you can look online and see all kinds of videos of drag shows being held at churches. You can see churches being headed by gay and lesbian pastors. Obviously 100 years ago, that would have just seemed absolutely insane, out of the question, let alone 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. How do you explain that? What's your thoughts on why that's happening, how it's happening?
I think Robert Conquest's second law is applicable here. Briefly, it is the idea that anything that is not explicitly right-wing or anything that's not explicitly traditional ends up becoming converged, becomes left-wing, becomes progressive, and that's the case as these mainline denominations die out. The shell that's remained is taken over by people who are engaged in the same sort of status seeking that leaders in all kinds of other institutions are engaged in. And so effectively Christianity, like Episcopal Christianity or a lot of Catholic dioceses, and all the other mainline Protestant denominations are engaged in something that is really only Christian vestigally, but not in terms of spiritually, would be my argument.
And I would argue not scripturally either.
Anecdotally, there is an Episcopal church near my house where from the outside you can see the "In Our House" sign. It's a big banner. It's like 10 feet tall. The one that reads, "In this house we believe Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, water is life, we believe in religious freedom, love is love, kindness is everything," etc., etc. You see that it's a 10-foot tall banner, and no hyperbole, there is not a cross visible anywhere from the outside of the building, but you can see that huge banner that greets you as soon as you walk in. And additionally, they have a trans flag flying.
So we've talked about the gay pastors, lesbian pastors, trans flag, rainbow flags being on top of churches, the Catholic Church essentially giving blessing to same-sex couples, all of these things happening around the same time that the term Judeo-Christian is gaining prevalence. Do you think there's a connection between those two things?
Yes, I think there's certainly a correlation between the two, whether or not there's causation intentionally or not. Jewish social values are and continue to be far more left-wing than Gentile Christian values do on things like same-sex marriage and abortion, transgenderism.
And are you referring specifically to American Jews here?
I am referring to all non-Orthodox Jews. There's about 10% of the Jewish population in the United States. I'm not sure what it is. In Israel, it's probably a higher percentage that have social values that are quite in line with conservative Christians. In the United States, it's about 10% of the population, but they have no institutional power at all. While their numbers are growing, if they come to represent the preponderance of Jews in the West a century or two into the future, Judaism will look a lot more like the Amish do in the United States today. That is to say, Orthodox Jews are right-wing and have no institutional power, just as the Amish today. But among the majority of Jews and all Jews with any institutional power, these social values are very left-wing. For example, if we look at abortion from the General Social Survey on the question of whether or not a woman should be able to obtain an abortion for any reason. So this is the most permissive, quote, extreme, unquote, support for pro-choice. For any reason at all, the woman decides that she wants an abortion up to the time of delivery. And the percentages of people who believe that a woman should be able to make that decision without any sort of restrictions at all among Protestants is 36%, among Catholics 37%, 36.5% for Catholics. Among Jews it's 80%. Among those who state that they have no religion at all, it is 67%. So we see that those who identify religiously, not ethnically, but religiously as Jewish, there's a higher percentage of Jews who support an abortion for any reason than there are even among self-proclaimed atheists and agnostics. So that's a pretty significant divergence from the more mainstream American view on abortion, and you have similar survey results for other social questions.
So on the surface, I think you would look at that and say, okay, that's interesting, but we're looking at a group, Jews, who are 2% of the U.S. population. So then to say that, to single them out doesn't really seem to make sense. So is there something more to that? What I'm getting at is Jewish overrepresentation in positions of power and influence.
Yeah, it leads to a zeitgeist where those positions or those views on social issues become normative.
Right. So there are some people who think it's a deliberate plot that Jews as a group are acting in their own self-interest, whether directly or indirectly, and pushing their own values. Where do you come down on that?
Like the Kevin McDonald culture of critique view that Jews have some evolutionary strategy that explains a lot of this behavior.
Yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm not too familiar with it, so I don't want to strawman the argument. But there are a couple major objections that come up immediately. The first one is the fact that the total fertility rate for Jews in the United States, specifically those left-wing Jews, not the Jews that have values that are comparable to middle American conservatives, but the 90% of non-Orthodox American Jews, to be below replacement fertility. So we're turning again to the General Social Survey. From 2000 onward, looking at those aged 45 and up older to allow for completed fertility to have been achieved, we see that Protestants average 2.33 children, Catholics 2.45, Muslims 2.52, Jews just 1.82, and those with no religion 1.69, and of course ethnic Jews that do not identify religiously are overrepresented in this category of those having no religion. So for it to be an evolutionary strategy, while Jews have the lowest fertility rates of any religious population or really any ethnic population in the West, it is seemingly contradictory on its face, and probably even more devastating than that is the astronomical rates of outmarriage among contemporary Jews in the West. So looking at something from Pew Research, these are responses in 2020. Jews who have married from 2010 to 2020 among non-Orthodox married Jews, again, who have married in the last decade, a staggering 72%, so nearly 3 out of 4 are married to non-Jews. And from 2000 to 2009, it was 54%. From 1990 to 1999, it was 41%. 1980 to 1989, it was 45%. And going back before 1980, it was just 18%. So a generation and a half ago, fewer than 1 in 5 American Jews married outside of their religion / ethnicity. And now, fast forward not even 40 years, and it's nearly 3 in 4 who marry outside. And for a population that represents just over 2% of the broader population, that is clearly not a strategy for posterity. It would be as if in apartheid South Africa, you had the white ruling class marrying and propagating, 3 out of 4 of their offspring were mulattoes, and instead of marrying other whites, they were mostly marrying blacks and turning over their assets to their mixed race children and giving political power to those mixed race children, et cetera, to maintain that was a concerted strategy for maintaining white supremacy is seemingly ridiculous on its face. But that effectively is what is happening today in the West. So I just don't know how the idea that some grand evolutionary strategy can be reconciled with those two big counterpoints.
So a related issue to all this is dual loyalty. You hear that word thrown around a lot, also a lot of times in the context of America first. What does it mean to be America first? Obviously, on the surface, it means you put America above any other country. And this is a topic that I've heard a lot of commentators pick up on. I would say it's kind of a debate among the right. Does America first apply to Israel? Because a lot of the same people who champion America first sometimes they'll be happy to say America first applies to Russia, Ukraine, but then when you say does America first apply to Israel, they have a very different answer. So let me play a clip from Chuck Schumer. He was speaking at an AIPAC conference.
Now let me close by telling you about my name. As some of you know, my name is a Hebrew word. Schumer comes from the Hebrew word shomer, which means guardian, watchman. My ancestors were guardians of the ghetto wall of Chortkov in Galicia. And when they came to Ellis Island, they said their name in Yiddish, Shomer, and it got written down as Schumer. To you, I say this. That name was given to me for a reason. For as long as I live, for as long as I have the privilege of serving in the Senate from New York, I will unflinchingly, unstintingly, and with all of my strength be Shomer Yisrael, a guardian of Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, Am Yisrael Chai. In Israel and America, the Jewish nation lives now and forever.
So I think here it's clear from that clip, at least to me, that while Schumer is ostensibly a senator from New York, he is going to weigh the interest of Israel, I would say, on the same level as he would the interest of the United States. And so the question is, well, what happens when the interests of the United States and Israel diverge?
That's why we have terms like Judeo-Christian, so that effectively Israel is thought of as the 51st state, whereas this is stark contrast to something that just happened with Ilhan Omar, where there was a speech she gave in Somali language that ostensibly she said pretty much the same thing. But because it's not insinuated by any institutions of power that Somalia is the 51st state in the United States, this is controversial, whereas what Chuck Schumer said isn't just not controversial, but it's almost required to be a sitting member of Congress or to be in really any decision-making position of institutional power in the modern United States.
And people sometimes ask, what's the problem with the United States supporting Israel? Of course we should support Israel. It's beneficial to the United States. To me, I think just in the past week, we've seen a clear-cut case of the cost of supporting Israel. The reason that those 3 U.S. soldiers were killed in Jordan near the border with Syria, at least ostensibly, was the attack was carried out because of what how the U.S. is supporting Israel. So to say, you can say that it's in the United States' interest to support Israel. Okay, you can make that argument, but to say that, but not to acknowledge the very serious costs of that support is very disingenuous. When people in the Middle East, when most people in the world look at what's happening, they see the United States as essentially a co-belligerent with Israel. There's very little distinction made in a lot of people's minds between the United States and Israel. And on that point, I find it interesting that the 3 soldiers who were killed were all black. And that made me think about it made me wonder where Black Americans are on the Israel-Hamas conflict.
That's a perfect segue to a recent YouGov poll that looks at that question in quite a bit of detail and breaks the responses down by race and a couple other categories. On the question of whether sympathies are more with Israel or with the Palestinians, among the general U.S. population, is 3 times more likely to sympathize with the Israelis than with the Palestinians. Among white Americans, it's actually 4 times as likely. So by a 4-to-1 rate, Americans sympathize more with Israelis than white Americans sympathize more with the Israelis than the Palestinians. Among blacks, it is almost evenly split. They are marginally more likely to say that they sympathize with the Israelis and the Palestinians, but it's a difference of 3 percentage points.
And so when you look at that, I wonder, when it's pretty evenly split among Black Americans on support for Israel versus Palestine, I wonder what Black Americans think when they see the first 3 casualties are Black Americans.
Yeah, and we can really open up quite a can of worms there when you start looking at Black views on questions that are quite sacred and taboo to be discussed in the United States. For example, in the same survey, Pew asked about the Holocaust, specifically put the question to survey respondents of whether or not the Holocaust was a myth. And 12%, so that's 1 in 8 Black respondents agreed that it is a myth, compared to just 5%, so 1 in 20 of whites. It's one of those interesting dynamics among what Steve Saylor would always call the coalition of the fringes, that in fact Biden voters and Democrats are substantially more likely to assert that the Holocaust was a myth than Republicans or Trump voters are. So 7% of Biden voters say that the Holocaust was a myth, and that of course comes predominantly from Black Biden supporters, whereas just 3% of Trump supporters do. So more than twice as likely. Biden voters are more than twice as likely to assert that the Holocaust was a myth than Trump supporters are.
And that just hammers home the absurdity of people claiming that the MAGA movement and Trump are anti-Semitic. The stats back that up being absurd, and let alone Trump having a Jewish son-in-law and Jewish grandchildren. I just find that funny that people try to make that anti-Semitism charge.
Yeah. Also, it's worth noting that Talking about Generation Zyklon, so among those under 30, some 20%, so from 18 to 29, because this survey was only conducted among adults, 18 to 29, 20% of respondents say that the Holocaust is a myth, compared to among boomers, those over the age of 65%, 0%. Literally, of the 352 survey respondents over the age of 65%, not a single one said that the Holocaust was a myth, whereas 1 in 5 of those under the age of 30 did.
And I'm actually surprised we've gotten this far into the episode without mentioning the Holocaust. I'm glad we mentioned it now because...
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, the decline in the use and the emphasis on the term Judeo-Christian tracks very well with the same with regard to the Holocaust. So we saw as the Holocaust was occurring, in the 1940s was when the term Judeo-Christian first began being used. And it culminated, or it reached its zenith point about 15 years ago and has declined slowly but steadily ever since. And we see, too, with the younger generation, just the emphasis, the historical knowledge, the idea that the Holocaust is something that's front and center in the thinking of people as they navigate the world really is something that is a generational thing that's changing as the boomers exit the stage and younger generations come onto it. The idea that America needs to do Israel's bidding because of the Holocaust and in an effort to prevent the Holocaust from occurring again in the future is going to weaken. Mining that survey further, there's also a question about U.S. military support for Israel. And among those under the age of 30, more people believe that the U.S. should reduce its military support for Israel than think that it should give Israel more support, whereas among those over the age of 65, they're 4 times more likely to think that Israel should receive more U.S. support than it currently does, rather than receive less. So Zoomers, or put it another way, boomers are about 5 times as likely to support increased military support for Israel than Zoomers are.
I also want to play another clip. This is Anthony Blinken, the United States Secretary of State. Shortly after the Hamas attack, he went to Israel, and here's what he said.
I come before you not only as the United States Secretary of State, but also as a Jew. My grandfather, Maurice Blinken, fled pogroms in Russia. My stepfather, Samuel Pizarro, survived concentration camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Majdanek. So, Prime Minister, I understand on a personal level the harrowing echoes that Hamas's massacres carry for Israeli Jews, indeed, for Jews everywhere. In this moment, where evil, hatred, and madness have once more taken so many innocent lives, we must stand together, resolved to confront what is worst among humanity with what is best.
So I do sympathize with that on a human level. I don't doubt the sincerity. But to say that and at the same time claim that the United States is an honest broker in this and that they are trying to reach a mutually beneficial or mutually agreeable settlement between Israel and Palestine, I just don't buy that, and I don't think most people buy that. And
I think the reaction would not be the same if, say, Lloyd Austin went to any number of sub-Saharan African countries and started talking about how where the massacres on a regular basis are numerically a lot higher than what happened on October 7th in Israel, and started talking about how, as an African, he understands at a deep human level how we all need to stand together and how the United States needs to get involved in every tribal dispute south of the Sahara Desert. And rightly so, because that totally destroys the idea of nationalism. The question is not why that would be rejected, but instead why Antony Blinken is not just permitted to allowed to get away with it, but is celebrated for doing so. And I think what we've been discussing here today gets at why.
We'll wrap up there. Thanks for listening to The Reality Taboo. Talk to you next time.